Welcome, everyone. We're so happy you're with us today. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful event in celebration of Steve Karakashian's memoir, One Life, Many Worlds. I'm so excited to have Steve with us today, and many of you know Steve. But for those of you who don't know, well, we don't know any of us all about him. There's so much. That's why it's many lives. He's played a very integral role in the support of the work at the Institute for Healing of Memories, both here and in South Africa. He spent a significant period of each year, over 3 years, working in the Institute's office in South Africa, which you can read about in his book. He was a board member of the Institute for Healing of Memories North America, and he continues to support our work generously to this day. He's an incredible human being, generous beyond bounds, and in every way, and has played a really important role in my life for many years now as a mentor and dear friend. Welcome, Steve. So happy to have you here. So I'm going to dive right in. And the first question I know everyone wants to know is why you decided to write your memoir.
Thank you, Gloria. That was over the top, the introduction you gave me. I'll answer your question, Gloria, but before I do, I want to thank several people who made this interview possible. That would be, first of all, Father Michael Lapsley, the founder of the Institute for Healing and Memories, who provided me with a wonderful opportunity to work with him in writing his memoir, and who has endorsed mine as well. The second person would be you, dear Gloria, who worked patiently with me to map out how we present a preview to you all without turning this into a semester-long university course. And then my much beloved publishing Sherpa, Mary Bisbee Beek, who has guided me through this process from the very beginning. Last, but very important, is my editor, Lynn Stegner, without whom this memoir would have been an unintelligible scramble. Also, I want to give a special greeting to my many South African friends who are watching, and also to my friend Marlo in Berlin. Finally, Gloria, about why did I decide to write a memoir? I think the answer is pretty uncomplicated. When you're in your 80s, which I am, you quite naturally want to look back over your life and ask yourself whether you've met your own expectations. That's something I've hopefully done pretty much my whole life, but this final evaluation that involved writing the memoir is part of it, and is the most important part, really. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Steve. In recent days, we're all witnessing a tragic situation unfold with the Israel-Palestine conflict. The loss of human life is horrific, and the innocent are suffering. Many don't understand the history of the region and this conflict, but feel the sadness deeply. The circumstances of your birth may shed some historical light on what is happening today. Can you speak a bit to that?
Sure. I was born in Palestine, so I'm an immigrant. And as I talk, I want you to pay attention to the dates, because this conflict goes back at least a century, if not more. And people don't realize that. So I'll be mentioning some dates just in this part of my talk and this part of the memoir. But the dates are important in order to cast some perspective on what's happening now. But I also want to say that in the 1920s, my own father, who was actually Armenian and grew up in Turkey, was a child survivor of the Armenian genocide by the Turks. He was orphaned as a child, and with his brothers and sisters, he lived through World War I in a refugee camp with no parents. He was quite traumatized by that. And after the war, the children were resettled in the Middle East, no two of them in the same place. But because Palestine had previously been part of the Turkish Empire and the Turks lost World War I, the League of Nations gave the mandate for Palestine after World War I to the British. And my father was taken into a British boarding school and given a very good British boarding school education, and he became a teacher. Now, I'll just pause there for a minute. Let's go back to my American mother. My mother had one great adventure in her life. In 1929, she went to the Holy Land to teach in a Quaker school. And there she met and married my father, who was teaching in the same school. We left Palestine in 1937, a year after I was born, because the clouds of World War II were already on the horizon, and my mother didn't want to be stranded so far away from home if there was another major war. I'd like to read a short passage from an early part of my memoir that puts the origin of today's horrific conflict into some historical perspective. In July of 1937, soon after we had arrived in America, my parents were interviewed by a reporter from my mother's hometown newspaper, asking their views on the Arab-Jewish conflict that had begun already. And was already a decade, and it's important to know this was a decade before Israel was even founded. There was no Israel at this point. The headline
So
of the,
would you,
yeah,
Steve, go ahead and read now from
okay,
your
yeah.
book.
So
Thank
now
you.
I'm beginning to read from my memoir. The headline, but I'm talking about this newspaper article. The headline of the story reads, "Difficult to remain neutral in present Holy Land crisis." And again, this is 1937. And much of it could be written today, 2 full columns long. It quotes my parents' account of the origin of the conflict. Despite the headline, their presentation is remarkably balanced in its depiction of both the Arab and the Jewish positions. I lost my place. My parents placed most of the blame squarely on the British for having separately promised the country to both the Arabs and the Jews. This was a decade before the United Nations partition of Palestine, before the founding of the State of Israel, with its massive displacement of the Arab population to refugee camps throughout the Middle East, and before the subsequent 1948 Arab-Israeli War. After those events, letters kept arriving at our home from my mother's Palestinian Arab friends, who were angry and in mourning over the loss of their homes and their olive groves without compensation. My mother became increasingly of the view that what was happening was brutally unfair to the Arabs, and I more than once saw her weeping. That said, she never stopped ascribing the ultimate responsibility to the duplicity of the British, who in the Balfour Declaration and other statements made promises to both the Arabs and the Jews that they could not keep. And then at the termination of the British mandate, they simply packed up and went home, leaving behind the mess they had created. And by the way, this is my comment now, by the way, the British did the same thing in India with similar consequences. I've stopped reading and this is my comment. I embody this conflict. I have many dear Jewish friends who have family in danger in Israel. And keep in mind, after the Holocaust, thousands of deeply traumatized survivors had no place to go, and the founding of Israel gave them a refuge. At the same time, my sense of fairness to the Arabs is acute because they were forced out of their historic homes with no compensation, and those who remain have been treated quite brutally and colonized by Israel. So let me say again, I embody this conflict. Is it any wonder that many years later, I ended up as a healer and a human rights worker in South Africa?
Thank you so much, Steve. It's for sharing that. It's what we're all focusing on right now. And I, like so many others around the world, are praying for peace, but also that we do the healing work necessary so that we can recognize, respect, and celebrate our shared humanity, of which so much of your book kind of encompasses of our interconnectedness. So thank you so much for sharing this. There's a lot in your book, definitely many lives. I'd like to now go to your early professional life as a biologist. At Rockefeller University, a scientist named Peter Marler was doing groundbreaking work studying the minds of other animals. You had originally been working on those little ticks and little things. Will you share more about that?
Sure. Yes, I will. Hang on to your hats, folks, because this is a giant leap. I was an infant. I was just reading something from when I was an infant. Now I've finished graduate school. I have a doctorate in biology, and I'm doing research at Rockefeller University. So that's a few decades. Anyway, I have always felt a deep kinship with animals. And Peter Marler, who was the animal behaviorist that Gloria just talked about, was engaged in exploring the minds of other animals. I had never met Peter, who was a world famous animal behaviorist, but his office was only 3 floors above the research lab that I had been working in at the time. So with considerable trepidation, I took the plunge and I approached him. In the end, Peter agreed to take me on, and he wisely paired me with a Swiss postdoc of his named Marcel Geiger. So early on, I knew nothing about animal behavior. The biology work I'd been doing before that, it was like working with a microscope and was completely different. So I turned to Marcel and I said, Marcel, please pour everything you know about animal behavior into my head. And he did over the course of the next few months, actually. So we did, and I didn't, many people in our lab were working in other countries, but I did not end up working with monkeys in Africa, nor with orangutans in Borneo, as others in our group did. But I grew to be on intimate terms with 10 pairs of gorgeous little golden sea bright bantam chickens. And for several years before Marcel went to Switzerland, he and I were a very productive team investigating the meaning of their alarm calls, which conveys information to other birds.
Would you read an excerpt from the book about this? This is fun.
Okay, when Marcel, so now I'm reading, when Marcel did finally return to Switzerland, a little bantam hen named Gigi, who Marcel was French speaking, so the bird was named Gigi, who had imprinted on him and followed him everywhere he went, and rode under his seat on the airplane, taking him home. Gigi lived out the remainder of her pampered life on Marcel's balcony in Lausanne. The 4 years I spent working with Peter Marler's Animal Behavior Laboratory were the most happy and exciting of my scientific career. Peter was one of the giants in animal behavior. He and his students and others he inspired ushered in a sea change in our understanding of other animals. He showed that animal communities, like human communities, communicate with each other through vocalizations. These convey useful information that the hearers act on in ways that are entirely appropriate to the situations they find themselves in. And this is important, what I'm reading next. The deepest significance of Peter's work is to be found in a broader context. He falls into a long and noble tradition, one that began with Copernicus and Newton, who dethroned humans from the center of the universe, and continued with Darwin, who demonstrated the continuity of human origins with all life. Peter and others inspired by him extended that tradition into the cognitive realm as well, placing human beings firmly within a continuum of cognitive evolution. Those wedded to human hubris no doubt find that unsettling, but others like me have found it thrilling to locate our rightful place in the cosmos. Peter contributed greatly to that project. He died on July 13th, 2014, at the age of 86. He took a chance on me because I knew nothing about animal behavior, and I hope he felt repaid.
I love that passage. And I dream of Gigi's life on the balcony on this song.
She just departed this little world.
A nice life for a
She's been
chicken.
long gone. But she was quite cute, especially following him around. She used to perch on the top of the door of his office, watching him work.
Oh my God, it's unbelievable, which really, again, is speaking to our interconnectedness with all things and all the world and all the cosmos. Thank you so much for that, Steve. Your life it's an adventure filled with different careers and amazing, profound personal life experiences. And what's so clear and inspires me is how your curiosity, courage, and not just willingness, but excitement to step in, help, be of service, and go on these adventures with an open heart is. I found so much inspiration in your book. Would you read an excerpt from your book about when you joined Riverside Church in New York City and how that decision to join was really a catalyst for much to follow?
It was. Sure, I'm reading now. The Buddhist that I had begun attending Riverside Church because it had a diverse congregation that was led by Dr. James Forbes, an African American pastor, and it had a strong commitment to social justice. So, seated in the congregation one Sunday morning in 1991, I was startled to hear Eric Colbell, the Riverside Minister of Social Justice, announced from the pulpit that the South African Council of Churches had asked Riverside to send a fact-finding delegation to South Africa. As I sat listening to Eric's announcement, I knew this was the opportunity I'd been waiting for, and I signed on immediately. I could not have imagined, though, that it would change the course of my life for years to come. It's impossible to exaggerate the moral degradation of apartheid. The Black majority was subject to the horrors of a brutal police state, while much of the white minority maintained a willful ignorance or outright denial of what was being perpetrated in their name. Whites lived comfortable, safe lives under a government that was for them a democracy and a racist colonial dictatorship for Blacks. So now there's a little skip, but I'm actually in South Africa for the very first time. This is the first time I was there. And so everything was new to me. And I'm beginning to read again. Soon after we arrived in South Africa, we were scheduled to visit Stellenbosch, a town of about an hour's drive from Cape Town. But before our van had traveled more than 100 yards, we were unexpectedly confronted with the harsh realities of life in South Africa. As we drove up the ramp to the main highway, we saw a white man standing over a Black woman who was lying at the edge of the road, bleeding profusely from her nose and mouth. He was a paramedic who happened to be driving by in his own car and stopped to offer help. He told us the woman had many broken ribs and that one of them had evidently punctured a lung, which was why she was bleeding from her mouth and nose. She looked emaciated, and I wondered if she might also have AIDS. He had called a public ambulance, and when after some time it had not arrived, we folks became impatient. And the paramedic, who was compassionate but realistic, said there were probably 100 cases in the queue for a scarce public ambulance, and there was nothing to do but wait. Meanwhile, he encouraged her to keep spitting up the blood that was collecting in her nose and mouth. I crouched down and held her hand, while positioning myself so as to shield her head from the hot sun. My colleague, Liz Gonzalez, dabbed her nose and mouth gently with a Kleenex. Eventually, a Xhosa-speaking man came to investigate what had happened. And after talking with the woman, he told us what she'd said. She and her husband had had an argument, and he had knocked her down, savagely kicked her, and then left. At a certain point, the young paramedic must have seen the stricken look in our eyes and said, when you're a paramedic, You just can't let yourself get attached to each person or it eats you up. There are so many of them. After about a half hour, the ambulance finally arrived, modestly equipped by American standards, but staffed by three caring colored men. Although the young paramedic assured us that the injured woman would get the surgery she needed, I had my doubts. I couldn't imagine, for example, that there was sufficient blood supply for the many cases of violence that have to be dealt with. Afterwards, I thought that the drama we had just witnessed was a kind of morality play that captured the tragedy of South Africa. Utter poverty, domestic violence, inadequate health care for Blacks, and kindly people, both white and Black, hemmed in by a thoroughly racist system. It was my second day in South Africa.
It's such a powerful passage of, yes, a tragedy unfolding in front of you, but also all of you, but also all the people who came together to help. And that is the beautiful part of that. And so much of that reads through the book of humanity coming together, no matter who they are, to help. So thank you so much for sharing that. This led you now 4 years later to becoming an international election monitor for the first democratic election in South Africa.
Yes, and I was really fortunate to be asked. Again, I was representing Riverside Church. I was very fortunate to be asked to be in that capacity. I mean, this was a historic election. It was ending apartheid. It was bringing the vote to white people, and people all over the world were supporting it. So the night before the election, we attended a mass at the Anglican Church in Sharpeville. And I'm going
to go ahead, Steve. Read
I'm going to read a little passage.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Go ahead.
Okay. So this, I'm reading now again. So we arrived at the church just as dusk was settling the church in its embrace. Inside, the light coming through the stained glass windows gradually dimmed as the African sun sank slowly below the horizon. The nave became suffused in the softly flickering light of candles, as if someone had gradually turned up the wick of an oil lamp. There was such an anticipatory murmuring in the congregation that it felt like Christmas Eve, perhaps because we were there to celebrate a birth, that of a new nation. The church was packed well beyond capacity. Children sat on their parents' laps to make room for more grown-ups. And people simply stood where they could. We international monitors were the guests of honor. As we filed into the church, dressed in our blue vests, the congregation rose, cheering and clapping, and we waved and bowed our greeting in return. As I stood there on the platform facing this cheering throng of people, I felt the sheer energy of their voiced appreciation in my body, and I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel bathed in its warmth. After several long minutes, at a signal from the priest, silence settled over the congregation, and we filed into our seats that had been reserved for us in the front row. The priest began by thanking us for coming to help protect them at some risk to ourselves, and reminded the congregation that our presence symbolized the hearts and prayers of millions of people the world over who were standing with them at this historic moment. We represented every continent save Antarctica, and we had chosen a person from each one to speak briefly to the congregation on our behalf. The Europeans had selected a young Belgian woman named Hildy. After some brief remarks, she said she would like to sing a South African freedom song that she had been taught by a South African friend whom she had met in Belgium. As she began to sing in the Sotho language, the congregation joined in because, of course, they understood Sotho. As we were enveloped in the melodious song of the congregation, I noticed a young South African woman determinedly picking her way down the packed central aisle. When she finally joined Hildy on the platform, the two hugged and tears rolled down their faces. When the singing finished, Hildy introduced her friend, who was the very person who had taught her the song. She had left Belgium and returned to her home in South Africa for the election, and neither knew the others would be present in the Sharpeville church. The reunion was immediately seen by the congregation as God's hand at work, and they greeted it with a chorus of amens and much clapping. After that, the Mass began, and I sat to enjoy the congregation's gorgeous a cappella four-part harmony. They sing their way through the entire Mass. At the climax of the Mass, when the priest turned and faced the altar, elevating the host high above his head, the singing reached a crescendo, and the congregation jumped to their feet and began to dance. If the Mass reenacts Jesus' triumph over death, on the eve of the election, no story could have been more fitting. By this time, dusk had settled into dark, and with the Mass now over, the congregation filed out into the African night, singing, and the sound of their voices gradually faded softly into the darkness as people disappeared into their homes. The headline in the Sowetan newspaper the next morning read, "Freedom in Our Lifetime."
You have to excuse me. I'm almost in tears hearing this. Now I've read it and I've heard it before, but given where we are right now with our concern for democracy and protecting it, South Africa's election and what they went through is such a shining light of example, and people need to rehear and know this history. So I love how much you write about this in the book, and also other parts of it, because you actually you speak to the day of the election, which there's so much profound interactions during that day and how people turned out. So just so remarkable, and something we really need to think about as we try to protect democracy today, which is under threat. So many years later, after you finished work in South Africa, another remarkable opportunity arises, and you were invited by one of the members of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be part of an official South African delegation to the 20th year commemoration of the Rwanda genocide. So an incredible honor and quite amazing, as you were part of a small group of only 4 people and the only non-South African. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. Before I start that, let me just say that in the book, I spend some time describing what happened on the actual day of the South African election. We didn't have time to go into that in this presentation,
which is amazing.
Yeah, it's quite a tale.
Yeah.
Okay, now to Rwanda. Yes, I was invited by Pumla Gobodo Madikizela, who was a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. It was quite a surprise, so much so that I was stunned when she called to invite me. And I was so stunned, I didn't accept immediately. Instead, I told Pumla I'd let her know later. I can't believe I actually said that, but I did. When I told my friend Mary Selnicker about it, she looked at me and she said, "Are you crazy, Steve? Go." and I did. Thank you, Mary. She's here listening. I flew from Portland to Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, And I met up with the other three members of our delegation there. There are two major ethnic groups in Rwanda, the majority Hutus, who are about 85%, and the minority Tutsis, who are about 14%. The Tutsis were favored by the colonial regime, despite being in the minority. I will not take the time to explain the details of the conflict, but suffice it to say that within 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsis and many righteous Hutus were brutally murdered by the majority Hutus, mostly with machetes.
And you also share, Steve, that the government there held commemorative places as a reminder of what had happened in the hope of ensuring that it would not happen again. And you write about that experience of visiting one of those commemorative places of the genocide.
Right. They're everywhere, and they're often accompanied by mass graves. I remember one little small town that we went to, and there was a mass grave that held, I don't know, who knows how many thousands of people, and really quite a small town. So this, for me, this trip, but we went to a different place where there was the same kind of memorial, and I'm now going to I'll describe that in my book in just a second. But I want to say that for me, this was one of the emotionally most intense parts of the memoir, and certainly the trip. The particular place we visited was a brand new school building. It had never been used. It was so new. And because Rwanda's a mild climate, the doors of the classrooms opened out directly into the outside. And 50,000 people fled there, hiding in these classrooms, hoping not to be noticed. Instead, they were murdered in the very classrooms where they hid. So now I'm reading. They were tricked into coming here, told they would be safe at the school, but it was a lie. The killers lay in wait, and there was no escape. Now their desiccated gray bodies, coated with lime, rest in a tangle of limbs on slatted wooden pallets in classrooms open to the outside air. Their bodies, hundreds of them, unceremoniously dumped here and left alone, naked and open to the cold. Jagged holes in many of the skulls give evidence of brutal bludgeoning, and I imagine I see terror in what remains of some of the faces. I feel fiercely protective of them. To enter one of these rooms is to leave the familiar world behind and enter another reality entirely. It took all my determination to overcome the urge to flee. Our experience of the world depends on sense perceptions that we have learned to trust since infancy. Nothing could have prepared me for what lay before me. My rational mind left me, and what remained was a mixture of horror and revulsion, and most of all, a profound, almost physical sense of disorientation. These corpses have been lying here in this position for 20 years, and yet I had the eerie feeling they were not quite dead. Despite that they were completely skeletal with skin stretched over bare bones, I expected one of them to move at any moment. I told myself that they were certainly dead, but another part of me remained unconvinced. And this jarring contradiction was a bit frightening. A vaguely menacing aura about the room was embodied by a sweet, sickening stench that pervaded my every in-breath. A smell reminiscent of the chemical odor that permeated Manhattan for weeks after the collapse of the World Trade Towers. I had the sense that spirits were hovering over these bodies, perhaps tethered to them, vexed and restless at being trapped in a limbo between the living and the dead. Their confinement had interrupted the natural process by which they fly away to wherever the spirits of the dead reside. Helpless and angry, they can only be freed when the bodies are given a proper burial. Did I feel the sense of menace because the spirits were displeased with me, another intruder into their tormented privacy? Despite this unsettling perception of threat, I nevertheless continued to feel fiercely protective of these souls, stranded here for 20 years, frozen in place, alone and bereft of the company of either the living or the dead. A single red rose a kind visitor had laid on the breast of one of the corpses only enhanced my sense of desolation. As I stood there, trying to recover some semblance of the rational person that I thought I was, what had been a gentle rain suddenly turned into a heavy downpour, drumming on the classroom's metal roof with such a fierce intensity that it frightened me. I was seized with a totally irrational impulse to cover these bodies in their nakedness from the cold and the damp. As the rain slackened off and I felt less afraid, I longed to assuage my loneliness, their loneliness, and mine, by sitting in meditation with them. But I lacked the courage, and the stench finally drove me away. I went back a second time, and again I retreated. Perhaps if I had stayed, the spirits would have quieted and opened a space for me. As it was, I am left with regret.
Almost feels like we need a moment of silence to sit with that. So powerful. And I know when I initially read it, I was in tears, and it actually haunted me for days, but it's a good haunting because we need to remember, and we need to know what we can do to each other, and we need to do better. And the way that you speak to it, you feel like you're there. So thank you. That's so powerful, Steve. And what an incredible experience. You write at the end of your memoir about a brief yet profound moment of human connection and recognition when you're leaving Rwanda, which is really quite beautiful. So I'd like to close with that excerpt before we open up for questions and answers.
Thank you. Yes, appropriately enough, I'm going to start reading in a second, but appropriately enough, I left Rwanda on Easter evening. So now I'm reading. On Easter evening, I arrived at the Kigali airport, preparing to depart for home. It was 3 weeks since I'd entered the alternate world that is Rwanda. Now it was drawing to a close. Was I glad to leave? Sorry to leave? I tried to sort that out, but I was in such a chaotic internal jumble that I actually had no idea. What I did know was that I was in a very private, reflective space, and I looked forward to the long nights on the flight to Amsterdam to begin figuring out who I was post-Rwanda. The young man behind the check-in counter was certainly Tutsi. Tall, lithe, with angular features, high cheekbones, and beautiful mahogany skin. I found him quite attractive, and I briefly enjoyed that sensation before it was interrupted by the thought of genocide. When it was my turn at the counter, I shoved my suitcase on the scale and smiled at him as I gave him my ticket and passport. After the usual rustle of papers, he handed me my boarding pass, and while returning my passport, he said in perfect English, "I noticed your name. It's Armenian, isn't it?" Startled, I responded that it was. Then he looked at me with a gentle smile and said, "I know about the Armenian genocide." I told him that my father was one of the survivors. We gazed into each other's eyes for a long moment, and tears welled up in mine. It was a moment of stunning intimacy. In a flash, it was over. We smiled at each other, and I disappeared into the waiting lounge. On the airplane, I gave thanks for such a fitting farewell. And then I regretted that I didn't even know his name.
Such an amazing experience to have at the airport leaving. And him, this recognizing shared humanity, understanding history, and recognizing you in that moment, which is so profound. Thank you so much, Steve. I just want to say a few words about Steve's book, and then I'm going to open up for questions. This book is an incredible read. And I say this to Steve, and he's like, I don't really know what you mean by this, but oftentimes it reads like a novel, like fiction, because there's so many phenomenal experiences in it. And Steve is an incredible writer. But it reflects upon a fascinating life journey, from a challenging childhood to one filled with many careers and life experiences, a journey of intense curiosity and reverence for the world and everything in it, and our interconnectedness. It's about courageous optimism and the humble pursuit of service to humanity, no matter the context, in numerous contexts, from a career in academia to science to psychotherapy to international work in South Africa and Rwanda. This book and Steve's story are inspirational and emotionally moving, with important philosophical and spiritual insights that are a reflection of all of us. So you won't want to put this book down, and I really cannot recommend it enough. I want to thank you all again for being here. Remember, the book is on like almost every country's Amazon, South Africa, Berlin, America, anywhere you want to buy it. So, support Steve in this and share it, because it's a profound piece of work.
I would,
you
if
much
you're
for it.
moved, I would appreciate you sharing it with friends, actually.
They will be moved when they read it, no matter what. I guarantee that. So thank you for being here. We so appreciate it. You all have a good rest of your evenings or day, wherever you may be.
Oh, right.
Steve, thank you so much. It's always just a joy to be with you.
Yeah, good. Thank you all for coming.
Wow,
and there's so many friends of mine here. It's wonderful.